Hi, I'm Ann Neese. For my master's work in the Plant Biology and Conservation program, I'm studying native Illinois orchids. But with the Illinois Orchid Society, I grow my own tropical orchids at home. So I'm going to show you today how to repot orchids. Something important to do after you buy one, and also something important to do every year or so. You might want to wear gloves. Because orchids are potted in bark, you may have splinters in there, and sphagnum moss tends to have prickly thorns inside of it. Also, a lot of growers use pesticides and fungicides on their orchids, and you don't want to get those chemicals on your bare hands. So this is a Phalaenopsis. You typically want to wait until after they're done flowering to repot them, but this one's already, you can see this one's already lost most of its flowers. So I'm going to go ahead and do it now anyway. So you want to be careful when you're unpacking it and try to not cause it too much damage. This is just a stake that they use to hold the plant up, so you can pull it straight out. And then you want to tilt it on its side and pull it out of the pot. And the reason you want to repot your Phalaenopsis shortly after you get them, they pot them in sphagnum moss for the transit and for the in-store storage, because you don't have to water it very often if it's in sphagnum. The problem is, and here you see that these roots don't look very healthy, is that sphagnum actually retains too much water, and which is conducive to root rot. Like most of your tropical orchids, Phalaenopsis are epiphytes, which means that they grow on trees. This also means that the roots are in the air, and there might be a little bit of detritus or dead leaves and moss and twigs and things in the tree with the plant, but for the most part the roots are growing on the bark of the tree and are exposed to air all the time. So when you stick them in sphagnum, which is a bog plant, you really give them way too much water and not nearly enough air. Another really important reason to repot your orchids after you get them, not long after you get them, is one, so you know how long, you can start a timetable so you know how long between repotting. Another reason is because you want to know the condition of your plant and what kind of care you need to give it. So if your roots are in really good condition, you don't have a lot to worry about, but if your roots are in rough shape, you might want to hold back watering for a while, give them some TLC and some extra attention. So as I pull this out, you can see these are the roots, and the stuff I'm pulling out from between them is the moss. So one of the really interesting things about orchid roots, and the reason these are so fleshy and thick, is because they have a coating called velamen that goes around the actual root core itself. And the reason that too much water is an issue for orchids is because the velamen's a one-way barrier. It lets water in unconditionally, but it doesn't let water out. So what happens is, if the plant gets more water than it can use, it just sticks in this fleshy tissue around the root, and it causes the roots to rot because there's too much water there and there's no flow of water. So think stagnant water isn't any good outside a plant, it's not good inside of it. So here you can see where the velamen's dried up, and this is the actual root itself. So if you compare a strip here with velamen, without velamen, you'll see there's a huge difference. And you can see these roots don't really look good, and that's a pretty good sign that they're not doing well either. So what you can do, there's two different schools of this. Some people like to just cut off the old roots when the velamen's gone. I prefer to strip off the dead velamen and to leave the root behind for two reasons. Number one, the root may still be able to take up more water, but the big reason is because it gives you a little something extra for the orchid to hold it on with inside the pot. Sometimes you can really run to, you see here that most of the long roots are going to be dead, and you've only got some short roots, so having these long fibers down deeper in the pot will help you keep the plant in there a little bit more securely. So although most of these roots don't look fantastic, they also aren't that too awful looking. This is really probably the most healthy section here, where it's green and kind of white, but something like this, it's yellow and black, isn't doing very well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to soak it in this solution just to make sure that there isn't any additional rot present. And the reason I'm concerned about that is just because I have some black spots here and there inside, and so I want to make sure that those don't turn into any kind of problem for the plant. This water is actually got a solution of a fungicide to make sure that any pathogens that might be on the plant roots are going to get killed, and if there's any root rot present, that it will kill that also. So I'm just going to set the orchid down into it, and I'm going to let it soak for a few minutes. These roots have been soaking for about 10 minutes, so they should be good and healthy now. And I'm going to repot it, actually back into its original pot, because once we took all of that moss away, you can see that there really isn't that much rooting material left over. One of the important things for an orchid pot is to make sure that it has lots of holes in the bottom so that you are sure that all of the water drains out every time you water it. you have options of plastic pots or clay pots like this one. Clay pots are really good for plants that prefer cool growing conditions because of the evaporative properties of clay and terracotta. They can reduce the temperature by a couple of degrees actually around the plant and help keep it cooler. If you have a warmer growing plant though, plastic is good, and it really doesn't make a difference whether it's clear plastic, green plastic, black plastic. It's up to you, whatever you prefer. It is important if you're potting plants into used pots that you clean and sterilize the pot before you put the plant into it. In this case, this plant's going back into its own pot, which is pretty clean, so I'm not too worried about any diseases in there. So I'm just going to first put the orchid into the pot, and I'm just going to gently tuck the roots down around it, and they'll kind of fall in. And I want to kind of seed it down as far as I can get it to go, and that's because it's got this really long, with Phalaenopsis, they send roots out between the leaves also, and since it's got this really long stem of leaves, I want to get that down in the pot pretty far in case it sends new roots out. When you're potting orchids, you want to put them in a mix. Your potting mix should vary according to what the plant needs. Phalaenopsis like a bit more humidity around them than other plants, and they have really big, thick, chunky roots which need a lot of area to move in. So a rougher bark is good for them so that the roots have room to get down in. If you use a bark too fine, it gets too compact and the roots can't get into the bark. Sphagnum moss comes from the store dried, and you have to soak it to have it rehydrated before you can mix it into your mix. Perlite really helps with keeping the potting mix airy as the plant breaks down the bark and the moss. So what I have here in my bucket is a mix I've made, and it's got sphagnum, and it's only got a little bit of perlite in it. So here you can kind of see there's some perlite, sphagnum, and bark. I prefer my potting material a bit on the drier side because I tend to water too much. If you're not going to water enough, then probably on the wetter side, which would mean more sphagnum, less bark, but it's really whatever works best for you and the plant you're working with. I'm just going to hold it up, and then I'm going to dump my mix in around it. So this is the part that you really have to worry about your hands on, because the sphagnum has those little thorns in it that will get you every time. So what I'm doing right now is I'm overfilling my pot. And the reason is because I've got to pack the potting material down in around the plant so that the plant will stay in place. And you remember all those big chunky roots are in the way of the potting material falling down. So the next thing, this is actually just a spatula knife thing. It's got one sharp edge, but I'm not going to use that edge. Just going to stick it down around the pot, and then I'm just going to work it in so the bark will fall down and work into the pot. Just try to not get anything with edges that are too sharp because you don't want to accidentally cut your roots, especially if you went to all the trouble of saving them. And finally, even though they're lovely, I'm going to take off most of these stems because I don't want the plant to make more flowers right after it's been repotted, and it will be easier to keep it from tipping over if there aren't any stems left. I'm using a pair of sterilized shears, and I'm just coming down in near the base of the plant and gently cutting as close to the stem as I can get. You want to try to not cut or scratch your leaves because that damage will be permanent. I'll leave this last flower on here since it's got 3 whole flowers and it's pretty. So the final thing I want to do is to stake it up again. So it came with a wide bamboo stake like this, which is really actually quite difficult to get into the pot because it doesn't have any points on the ends and because it's so wide. So instead I'm going to use this stick that has a point on the end and is a bit more narrow, and that will be much easier for me to get into the pot. And then I'm just going to hold the plant up near, and I'm going to use the twist tie that it came with to twist it back on again. Also what works really good for this is florist tape, or they have those little tiny baby butterfly clips. Those work well also. I would say wait a few days before you water it so that new root growth is stimulated, and water it more sparingly than you normally would for the first month or two that it's in the new pot so that it makes new roots. You're welcome to come to the spring show at the Chicago Botanic Garden. The Illinois Orchid Society will be there selling and repotting plants, and the garden will have a beautiful display of many different orchids from across the world.